Awesome. Okay, so give you a little intro to who we are. Jess and I both work with Ocean Strategies, and OS is a public affairs firm that does, mostly fish-focused policy and communications work all across the U.S. We work with harvesters, processors, distributors, retailers in every region of the country, and we work with sport and subsistence stakeholders as well. And one of the ways that we connect to the issues is by interviewing experts and leaders like yourself in the fishery space. And we're glad to be sitting here with Alaska's Representative Mary Peltola, newly reelected to represent the nation's northernmost state and fisheries powerhouse, Alaska. And this is super special to the Ocean Strategies team in particular because we're a firm founded and led by lifelong Alaskan fishermen, and just really happy to be visiting with you today, and welcome.
Thank you. I just had a group from Kodiak come in, and it was a huge group of people. We spent 50 minutes talking in depth about many Kodiak fish issues. It was 100% fish issues. So and honestly, it is my favorite topic to talk about. It is the reason I'm so glad to be in Washington, D.C. And honestly, I think it's the reason Alaskans sent me here is to talk about fishing.
Well, I can second that. My name is Hannah Heimbuch. You know that I am a Kodiak-based commercial fisherman, and we do a great deal of subsistence harvesting there as well as commercial. And I know that you understand and appreciate all of the different ways we harvest here in Alaska. In the other part of my life, I'm a communications consultant and really happy to be able to participate in conversations like this. And I'll also let my friend and colleague Jessica introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Jess Hathaway. I'm a fisheries, seafood, and fishing community communications and policy specialist with Ocean Strategies. And that's a long way of saying I'm a consultant with Ocean Strategies. And I'm actually based in Portland, Maine. So I'm also on East Coast time over here with you. My fisheries experience is more general, having served as editor of National Fisherman magazine. I was there in total for about 16 years and editor for a little over a decade. And that was right before I joined Ocean Strategies. So I have more of a broad-based experience with fisheries and less hands-on than Hannah and my other colleagues. But I'm so glad to be here with you today. And I love Alaska too.
Okay, good. Well, Hannah, you'll understand, as a child, I would have thought anybody in fisheries communications would just be hollering, no, the other left, like set it that way,
I do that too.
Not as well as you're doing. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I've adapted over time.
Yeah. So Representative Peltola, can you introduce yourself before we jump into our questions?
Sure. Agaskunga, Yupigo, Mamdresler Miungunga, Guskukvar Miungunga. I'm Mary Peltola. I'm from Bethel, whose Yupik name is Place of Many Fish Caches, which illustrates how dependent we've always been on harvesting fish and particularly salmon and drying that salmon and storing it away for the winter. I'm from the Kuskokwim River. Kuskokwim means big, slow-moving thing, and at the lower end, it is a very big river, and it's that's a bit of a misnomer because there are many places where it's very fast-moving, especially on an outgoing tide. But I am newly elected. I was elected to fill out the remainder of Congressman Young's term, the end of 2022. And then I was shortly thereafter elected to a 2-year term of my own, representing Alaska in 2023 and 2024. So I'm very happy to be here. When I ran for Congress, my platform was being pro-fish, pro-family, and pro-freedom. And it's not, there's a reason they are in that priority, because for me, fish is everything. I'm made of fish. The people that I come from are heavily dependent on fish and in particular salmon. And I think it is a very common thread throughout Alaska to have this relationship and identity with fishing. So I'm really proud of the fisheries that we've always had in Alaska, and my goal is to make sure that we can maintain the same kind of abundance that we grew up with.
That is an awesome way to start this conversation. And moves us nicely into the first question. We always try to start with something light, which is what is your favorite fish? But since we're both harvesters, I thought I would ask you, what's your favorite place to fish and why do you love it?
So there's a small tributary on the Kuskokwim above Bethel, and its name is the Gweek River, which is redundant because Gweek means river in Yupik, so it's like the river. And it's not a salmon bearing river. Our salmon don't go up there to spawn, but it's very abundant, and there are salmon. We still have tidal influence even that far up the river. Bethel's about 75 miles off of the Bering Sea, off the mouth, and then this is probably 15 or 20 miles up, and we still have tidal action. And so fish come in, they push into the Gweek, and it's a pretty productive place to fish. And so I grew up commercial fishing there. And for some reason, I didn't really wonder why, but I found out why I grew up fishing there. And it's because, and this was commercial fishing back in the day. My mom's grandparents actually lived at the mouth of the Gweek River year round. And so they had a lot of very discrete knowledge of where to fish for certain species. And my mom's brothers taught my dad how to commercial fish, and that's who I grew up commercial fishing with. He's actually from Nebraska, so he has no generational knowledge of fishing, but lucked out with my uncles being willing to show him how to do it. And so, when our abundance went down, it was really important to me to make sure that I wasn't fishing for kings when I wasn't trying to target kings. And my mom's younger brother, Philip Nose, taught me exactly where to set my set net. And the amazing thing was, and I shouldn't have been so surprised by this, but every time I checked that net, it was like 90% red. And there were a few chums. I caught one king salmon that first summer. And so this is a really good example of this very discrete knowledge that has been passed down through generations. And so I have been a real beneficiary of that kind of insight. And so I've just kind of inherited this really great place through my family.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story.
That is the best entry I think I've ever heard into maybe any interview. And I know I'm biased, but that was just beautiful and amazing. Thank you for sharing that. You took us there, I could see exactly where you were. It was really beautiful.
Thank you.
But we're going to move away from that into some policy talk. So we were ripping you right out of that and back into DC. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
We're going to talk a little bit about Magnuson. We know that you got a taste of that process last year. And so we're curious about, what your vision is for that process, because the road to the next Magnuson approval is likely to be long. And we are wondering what you see, what's coming next, and what are your priorities to try to move that along and move the dial a little bit.
So in the 117th Congress, Representative Jared Huffman from California had some legislation on reauthorizing Magnuson-Stevens Act. He and his staff asked me to be an expert witness in the WOW subcommittee, the Wildlife, Oceans, and Wilderness. I can't remember the acronym exactly, but it was the WOW subcommittee. And so I was able, and part of the reason I was asked to be the expert witness is because Representative Huffman and Representative Young had a gentleman's agreement that whoever the Alaskan person was who was testifying needed to be somebody that Congressman Young was okay with. And so Don Young okayed my participation, and I was able to have a good conversation with both of them about an element of Magnuson-Stevens that some people in Alaska think would be a positive change, and that's to have tribal representation on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And I also spoke about other issues, bycatch and lack of abundance, and ways that Magnuson-Stevens could be more receptive to some of the big paradigm changes that we're seeing now. So that was in November of 2021. Sadly, on March 18th of 2022, Congressman Young passed away, and that put a stop on Magnuson-Stevens going forward because Representative Huffman was still honoring his commitment to Congressman Young to work in a collaborative way. And I think there was an assumption that it would still be a bipartisan way, but still maintaining that promise to Congressman Young to work with Alaska on this bill. And then when I was elected to the special election seat, one of the first people who called was Jared Huffman to say, hey, let's keep working, now we can hit go again on this and try to get Magnuson across the finish line. So we were able to get it out of Resources Committee. We had a markup, it went to the floor, and then quickly was dead on arrival in the Senate because there was a Republican majority on the Senate side who were not in alignment with that bill 100%. So it didn't pass last time, although there was a lot of effort and I think a lot of goodwill. So this Congress is much the same. The 118th is much the same as the 117th. It's just that the majority switched in both chambers. And I think that there is not a very strong likelihood. I think everybody recognizes that there's a very slim chance that Magnuson-Stevens will be authorized this year. So, or this Congress in the 118th. And one of the things that I've been really becoming more and more aware of, and this was a joke that Congressman Young had, he said, I'm a Republican and our enemy aren't Democrats, it's the Senate, because 90% of the work that the House does dies in the Senate. And of course, he didn't mean our senators, our Alaskan senators, but just the 100 members, because so much happens here that doesn't go through there. So I really am trying to be very careful about not spending time on bills that aren't going to get anywhere after the House. But I do remain optimistic. I would like to work with NOAA and NIMFS and ask, and we've had these conversations, and other Alaskans have had these conversations with NOAA saying, since we're not optimistic about Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization, can we take another look at these national standards and see about looking at the intent language and really trying to honor that intent language. And I know in the state legislature, we call it intent language. And at the federal level, it's really referred to as guidelines, the implementation guidelines for the national standards. And there are a number of them that Alaskans find relevant and largely ignored. And so I think one of the things that many Alaskans are looking at as a workaround to a reauthorization this time around is this issue of recommitting ourselves to these implementation guidelines. So, and there's a number of them, I think some more relevant than others. Number one, the National Guideline 1 is optimum yield. And we really do need to define what optimum yield means. And in state, this is also up for debate often, is at the Fish and Game, at the Board of Fish level, it's called maximum sustainable yield. And so I think that we really need to have a conversation about what is the optimum yield? And I think, really need to assess this over commercialization in some ways, and just, under this paradigm, under a low ocean productivity paradigm, how much pressure can we really be putting on these stocks? And I honestly even think we should be having a conversation about words like escapement, the word escapement is very loaded. It's a very kind of judgy word. I mean, the way that escapement is used is like those fish were left on the table or wasted because they went up and spawned. I think that we need to start thinking of, what's called escapement as spawners or eggs in the ground or an investment. And as an example, Chinook salmon on the Kuskokwim, the spawner recruit ratio used to be 1 to 6. So for every hen that spawned, 6 would return. That spawner recruit ratio is now 1 to less than 1. So we have to be so much more intentional about these investments in eggs in the gravel. So that's one. 2 is best science. That's another concept that's got a lot of debate around it, but I certainly think that it's relevant. It's a timely conversation because at Board of Fish, there was a lot of discussion about science and Fish and Game saying we don't have to use the newest science, the best available science. And there are groups, like stakeholders on the Kuskokwim who are saying 1950s science is not the best available science. We need to be using 2023 science. So that's one thing. The second thing. So 4 is allocation and really considering gear types and the different impacts of the various gear types and making sure that we're not negatively impacting species of concern. 6 is variations of catch. And again, we're in a different paradigm. The last time Magnuson Stevens was reauthorized was like 06 or 07. I've seen both of those in print. But regardless of whether it was 06 or 07, that was a paradigm of abundance. And we had all species in abundance. On the Kuskokwim River, the Yukon has been closed for 3 years to salmon fishing. And these are communities that have relied on this resource for over 12,000 years. And this is documented through Western science. So 3 years of total closure. And then on the Kuskokwim, we have been at 20% of our total need for 13 years on Chinook salmon. We have been at 0% of our need for the last 3 years on chum. Silvers were restricted last year. So again, maybe 5 or 10% of our real need. The species that's in abundance on our river are reds, sockeye, and it's very hard to harvest them because they run with kings and chums. So when those species are of concern and we're really trying to get those eggs in the gravel, it's just hard to also be fishing for reds because we're using the same gear type. So 8 is a very, very critical national standard. And I think that there are stakeholders in Alaska who have really articulated this very, very well, but it's about communities and thoughtfully considered in fisheries, those communities dependent on fisheries being thoughtfully considered in fisheries management plans. And I think that we need to look at communities that are dependent on our salmon resources, our fishery or crab or halibut, whatever the resource is, commercial fishermen, sport fishing communities that like Kenai and Soldotna, that are, their whole economy is very tied to the availability of fish species for recreational purposes. And then of course, we should also be considering the communities, like I mentioned on the Yukon, that exist, that are there because of their relationship, a 12,000-year relationship to salmon. As an Alaskan and in our Constitution, it says, no one user group is more important than another. No one group has more rights than another. And I can certainly understand that. But I think that we should be having honest conversations about the fact that it seems like subsistence fishermen are getting zero consideration, and there is zero thought about the management implications when they are getting 0% of the resource. And then 9 is bycatch, and of course, many people across Alaska think we could be doing much better. For Alaska Native communities, wasting is one of the worst things that you can do. Throwing a species back that's given itself to you is the ultimate affront to Mother Nature, and there are consequences for that. We really firmly believe that. So this idea of being able to toss back juvenile crab and halibut and salmon, we understand that does have consequences. And maybe it takes 30 years to see those consequences, but it is consequential. So bycatch is a very sensitive issue. And for communities that have had to really ratchet back their harvest for 13 years, to then not see other sectors having to ratchet back their harvest is very difficult. And that is something I hear very often. It's just that disparity. So that's my short answer to Magnus and Stephen.
Oh, it was never going to be short. We know, we know if we ask about Magnuson, that's what's happening. And I'm really glad. Oh, go ahead.
The one thing I do want to say, and I didn't know this before I testified in November of 2021, but Congressman Young said that, Magnus and Stevens was a Senate bill, but when it started out in the House, he and a congressman with the last name Studs were the sponsors, and so they called it the Young Studs bill. And I wish that it had remained the Young Studs bill, but it became Magnuson Stevens after Senator Magnuson, and of course, our very beloved Senator Ted Stevens.
Well, I feel honored to have been on several young fishermen's trips to Representative Young's office where he told that very joke every time, and it never got old.
Yeah, no, I love it. Young Studs.
Well, I'm glad you told us that story, and I'm really glad too that you brought up the implementation guidelines. Because those of us that are looking at the conditions that our fishing communities and fishing ecosystems are facing, we definitely see exactly what you've described, that there's a level of change that's we're unable to deal with in some cases in a status quo system, right? And so barring the ability to reauthorize Magnuson anytime soon, a lot of us, like you said, are really looking to those implementation guides and saying, language matters in this case, how we're interpreting yield and whether it's just economic or many other values that mix into that, and how we're defining fishing communities and what access means. And so really excited to hear you talking about those guidelines as a key part of leadership and legislation. And I know a lot of people are curious. We haven't seen a confirmation from the agency at this point about moving forward, but as a leader in fisheries in DC, would you be supportive then of the agency moving ahead on updating implementation guidelines? And are there maybe a couple of key provisions that are like top 3 priorities, you think?
Well, not only would I like to see that, but I've been in the conversations I've had with Janet Coit and other leaders, have been very assertive that this needs to happen, because the feds have a seat on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council for a reason. They're not there for window dressing. They are really there to co-manage, and they have supremacy as the federal agencies, and they need to take that responsibility seriously. And we need their help, and we are imploring and begging them to step up and really fill that void and there has been a void there for a number of decades, and we really need their guidance and their leadership. And this is why they are on those councils to begin with.
And that includes, but certainly isn't limited to, fishery management and access. But I wanted to ask you, what does an equitable fishery management process look like to you? And how do you see it being important to the whole in our communities and in policy work? And that can be, it could be law, it could be procedure, it could be outcomes, it could just be your fantasy of what the future of equitable access looks like in Alaska, or just, in the, nationwide domestic access.
So I think one piece of it is representation. And one of the shortcomings that I think we've seen in our current structure is that tribes are not at the table, Indigenous people are not at the table. And we're not saying that we want to change the composition to remove all of the other user groups and all the other folks that are representing. We're just saying we also want to be at the table. We don't want to outnumber anybody. We don't want anyone to feel surrounded by us or taken. We don't want to do a hostile takeover. This isn't a power grab. We just want a seat at the table. We just want to be part of the discussion and at the same level that the other folks are. So the frustrating thing for me when I was testifying to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council is I was granted 3 minutes to talk about these huge changes to our ecosystem and the resulting tremendous food insecurity and changes to our culture and our way of life and our just overall security. And if I was a representative of a group, then I got 6 minutes. That just isn't enough time. I mean, we've been on this call for 33 minutes and we've just scratched the surface. So that is not equitable. I don't have the perfect idea of what equity is, but I know that what we have now is we have so much room to improve. And one of the things, my most recent former job is the executive director of the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission. And I think that the partnership that the 33 Kuskokwim tribes have with our refuge, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is a lot closer to equity because the Kuskokwim River Intertribal Fish Commission has a memorandum of understanding with the refuge to co-manage. And what that means is that fish and game data is included, fish and wildlife fisheries biologists input is included, and then the 33 tribes, they select 4 in-season managers to also give their input. And what it's done is it's revealed that there are gaps in Western science indexes. One of those gaps is not having a very accurate forecast for the upcoming run. So on the Cusco, we saw for a run, our average run size for kings, it used to be like 300,000. Now it's about 120,000. So that's the average run size. But between 2019 and 2020, we saw plus or minus 100,000. So in 2019, the projection was it would be a run size of 120,000. It was actually 220,000. So then in 2020, the projection was 220,000, but it was 120,000. That is a big gulf. And one of the really interesting things that happened in 2019 and in 2017, one of our commissioners, his name is James Nicorai, and he's from Queethlook. He's from the village my mom is from. He brought in this correlation between king salmon and Canadian geese. And he looked at the migratory bird return in April. And from 2017 to 2021, the last year I worked for the Fish Commission, there was 100% correlation between high abundance, whether they're early, on time, late. In 2020, 2020, I think it was, no, 2021. So in 2019, James Nicorai said, I think that after the escapement count comes in, you are going to be very pleasantly surprised. I know that we will meet our escapement goals, even if we fish 18 more hours. So we fished 18 more hours and we had much, much more than had been predicted. And then in the next summer, the department had predicted 220,000. They wanted to really fish hard, and James said, no, we can't do that. The bird return was more average. We have to ratchet back. So we did, and we made escapement. And then in 2021, we were very worried about the king return. And James said, no, I thought about how the birds came back, and they came back in a big bunch, and then they tapered off. And the second bunch was even bigger than the first bunch. Lo and behold, that's exactly what happened with the kings. And I shouldn't consider it uncanny. This is traditional knowledge. If a group of people have been living in one place for 12,000 years, they are going to have an understanding of the resources. And we may not consider it science, but on some level it is science, and it is traditional knowledge, and it is relevant. And I think that it can fill gaps that we have in Western science and complement it. And the vast majority, I mean, 99% of the people who are commissioners on that fish commission embrace Western science, and we appreciate Western science, and we want to use it. But we also want to share our knowledge and help where we can. We want to also contribute. And so that's a good example in my mind of better equity. And I think that it really results in more environmental justice and more racial justice, to just have folks welcome to the table and hear them out and see if they have a contribution to make summer after summer. And I think it's fascinating. I would never have suspected that migratory birds would correlate to the migration of the fish return. But on some level, it does make sense. These are migrating species. There have to be similarities going on our planet between the sky and the oceans and rivers. So that is the next short answer to your question.
I am so glad that you gave us such a profound and thorough example of equity, because like you said, it's not simple. There's not one answer. There's not one problem either. It's very much rooted in everything we talk about. So you mentioned representation. That's an equity component, participation in process and equitable access to giving input and affecting management. And then this really important discussion about knowledge systems and how do we integrate diverse knowledge systems that all have a valid role, right? And to me, like what they have in common, both, Western science, best science, as they call it in Magnuson, and, traditional knowledge systems and local knowledge, is that they're never done. You're constantly evolving and responding to the environment as it gives you information. And that's what science is supposed to do. And that's what our community knowledge systems do as well. And so my hope is that our fishery systems can be kind of brave and say, this was never supposed to be stagnant. It was always supposed to evolve.
And our councils are supposed to use adaptive management. They just haven't been doing that.
Yeah. And I think it's a worthwhile and brave conversation for us to have and say, okay, how can we adjust? And I see equity as one of those systemic issues that really comes up in everything, much like climate. So my next question is around climate here. And that's woven into everything we talk about now, right? And so just a couple of policy-centered questions on that. We know the Biden administration recently released its ocean climate plan. So what is your view on how that should take shape in government programs, especially those affecting fisheries management? And kind of, do you have any specific expectations or concerns around that plan?
We're not short of our reports, and what we are short of are actual management plans and adaptive management and next steps, and how we can adjust our system to better match the demands that we're seeing. And I just, this isn't going to happen quickly. We all recognize that government doesn't happen quickly. It's taken us 30 years to get to this point. It may take us 30 years to course correct, but honestly, we don't have 30 years. Like I said, the issues of low abundance we've seen across Alaska and the different regions, it's a different amount of time. Like Norton Sound, they've been short on salmon for 20 years, or actually 30 years. The Yukon has seen a real depletion in their abundance for 20 years, and the Cusco has seen it for over 10 years. We're seeing a real shortage of abundance on the Kenai the last 10 years, almost every river system. And then we saw this crab crash. Halibut abundance is very low. We're seeing kind of this cascading issue of these downward spirals of abundance and health. And it's not just abundance, it's that so many are coming back very small across the board. All species are much, much smaller. This is a worldwide issue. And there's a disproportionate number of males to females from what we grew up with. So we've got to adapt, we've got to pivot. We don't have time for 10-year data sets, 20-year data sets. We've got to start taking action. And half a loaf is better than a whole loaf. Even if it ends up being a 20-course meal and not a feast at once, that's fine. Let's start implementing the courses. Let's start, soup to nuts, like they say. I love all the English sayings, like red herring. It took me so long to figure out what a red herring was. Same with soup to nuts. But very seriously, we need to start really looking at bite-sized pieces and changes wherever we can make them. If the only change we can make in the 118th Congress is to take another look at these national standards, we've got to do it, and we've got to do it now.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, and not a small bite, but a big one, I would like to talk a little bit about bycatch. You've been openly supportive of bycatch reform in the North Pacific, and your reference to the crab crash, the halibut abundance issues, salmon abundance issues throughout the state of Alaska. I want to talk a little bit about if we can squeeze in a little bit about Alaska's bycatch review task force and their recommendations, as well as, you got some zesty national press coverage with that Politico article, and it's really brought this topic to the national stage from our perspective. I know that a lot of us have been talking about this already, but I'd like to hear what you've heard as a result of that article, and I know that you talked about the bycatch issue at Comfish recently. So if you could just give us like a general update on that topic and what you're hearing on the Hill and locally in Alaska.
So among us, this seems like a no-brainer, but I think at the congressional level or at a statewide leadership level, I think there's relief among fishermen that someone is saying this out loud in public and wanting to have these really hard conversations. And of course, we have to have our commercial fishing sector. It's a huge pillar of our Alaskan economy. And like I said, it's our identity for most of us, and it's a family business, and it's everything to us. It's not only our identity, but our identity back through the generations. Like if you look at Petersburg, they're Scandinavian fishermen. It's in their blood. Almost every community in Alaska, it's part of our identity in one way or another. But we haven't really been having these difficult conversations at this level. And so that's the feedback that I'm getting is, I'm just so glad you're talking about this. And I am very happy about the Politico article. Now we just need 6 more articles like that, because advertisers, and you are both in communications, you know, it takes people at least 7 times to hear something before it starts sinking in. So we need 20 more Politico articles. And I think, and one of the things I'm concerned about is the Washington Post is going to say, oh, Politico already covered that. The New York Times is going to say, Politico already covered that. The Huffington Post, like on down the line. I mean, all of these outlets should really be sending a reporter to come and talk about it. And another thing that I have found frustrating about fisheries management over the years are the number of elected officials who will say, or other, you know, journalists who say, oh, it's just too complicated. I just don't understand. It's not complicated. It's so simple. This is simple. It's allocation. It's assessing what is harvestable. It's assessing what we really need to be making sure we're investing in terms of eggs in the gravel. All of these things are as simple as they're as complex or as simple as we make them. There just has to be political will. So I think there's this relief that there are the beginnings of conversation and this push. And I will say that it's so important. It can't just be elected people doing this work. It has to be people like you. There has to be an outside push. The system that we have in America is one where the elected officials are not the thermostat, we're the thermometer. The public is the thermostat, and we need as much pressure as ever from fishermen to make sure that there's the political will. This has to be kind of the make it or break it issue for campaigns across the board if we're going to see real traction.
I think we're going to wrap up here shortly, but before we let you go, and thank you so much for spending this time with us. I know it's been a really amazing almost hour, and we really appreciate your time. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to mention any fish-focused legislation that you're championing or hoping to push through.
I do think that we have to have a host of things. It's visas. It's really having good conversations with the various commercial fishing sectors to find out how we can help, whether it's creative solutions to housing issues or like I said, visas or marketing, just many different things. We really need, and then really broad things. We are food. We provide food to millions of people, and we shouldn't just be, under the Secretary of Commerce. It somehow does not make sense. So a lot, big things and small things, all of it needs attention.
Well, thank you so much for that, and really appreciate your willingness to give those things attention and have the hard conversations. And thanks again for just your time today and your insight.
Thank you guys. You can tell I just love talking about fish.
Us too.
We'll take it anytime. Yeah.